Today on Hands on History, we're going to take a look at the Spanish Conquistador, really in the 16th century time period. So we'll talk about the nature of the armor, we'll look at the weapons, the daily life of the average Spaniard, and ultimately we'll break it down as far as why small numbers of conquistadors are able to defeat much larger groups of natives. Have you ever wanted to quit your day job and conquer some shit? Well, this is for you. Let's take a look. Hands on History, where we don't just learn from history, we live it. Today on Hands on History, we're going to take a look at the Spanish Conquistador, really the weapons and armor of the 16th century, and talk about the nature and historical context of why some of these things came to be. Every armor has a story, every weapon has a story. Hopefully, we can begin the process of looking at it. Obviously it's not the last word on the subject. That's for all of y'all. Feel free to comment, like, subscribe, etc. Feel free to present your own stories as far as your own research and what you've looked at into. But what I'm looking for primarily is for my 1301 and my 1302 classes. They obviously ask me a lot of questions on the Conquistador, where we live. It's a very potent topic. And so I just like to address what it was like to be an average soldier. It's always what's fascinated me is the battlefields of Europe and Asia. Not necessarily what command went through, because we have a pretty good idea usually from the books that say Grant did this or Lee did that. But I like to look at what the common soldier did. It's my opinion they're the ones that ultimately win the battles. So what was it like to be a conquistador? What kind of weapons did these guys use? The armor, tactics of the day. Those are all things that we're going to be exploring today. Mostly the targeted audience here is primarily my 1301 and 1302 classes, but obviously general audience as well. If you're somebody who's interested in this period, if you're somebody who wants to know a little bit more, hopefully we can break down the day-to-day aspects of what it was like. We have really good sources on this, everything from Bernal Diaz to as far as primary sources, they're okay. Mostly from the Spanish perspective, not a whole lot of stuff from the native perspective. We got some codexes, right, that will help us as well. But not as many sources as we would wish. Certainly, there's some gaps in the resource material. So we tend to fill those in as much as we can through reenactment. And so the purpose of reenactment largely is to recreate a historical period. And again, the point of that is to look at what the average person did. So that's what we're going to be exploring today and taking a little bit of a look at. First of all, we'll start as far as the weapons of the Conquistador. They changed over time, obviously, but in the 16th century, these were some of the weapons that you could see on a type of soldier that was called a rodolero. Rodoleros were so named for their large shield, which we'll talk about later. But basically, these were sword and shield kind of guys. Sometimes they're called sword and buckler, but it's kind of a misnomer to call them this because a buckler is a tiny shield, all right, that people could basically just carry on their belts. And this thing's going to be much larger. So it's kind of more of a throwback to shields from the earlier years that were larger and covered large segments of the body. And so they got this name, right, these rodoleros, right, guys who essentially were carrying the very famous Spanish side sword or espada ropera, and of course the patented rodela shield. These guys would have been fairly well armored. It really depended because, as far as the historical context, most of the conquistadors themselves had served as mercenaries in past campaigns. They'd done fighting, and usually these companies' rules, there weren't any. They basically could procure their own equipment as they could so fit. So that included grabbing weapons off the battlefield, and it included providing their own. So the vast majority of soldiers, contrary to the popular myth of everybody being encased in armor and coming to the New World, is a fallacy. The vast majority of people who came to the New World didn't have a lot of armor at all. In fact, I'm going to represent really about the top 5 to 10% of the conquistadors as far as kit and what they're going to be wearing into battle. So we'll talk about the nature of the kit. We'll talk about essentially some of its function, and we'll basically describe what it is about the conquistador's kit that largely makes them effective. So the Okay, we're continuing our discussion today about the Spanish Conquistador, particularly the weapons and armaments of the Conquistador. And what we're going to be looking at today are the accoutrements. So the things you probably don't see a whole lot of, but perform necessary functions as far as equipment. Obviously, the first thing we're going to take a look at is the gambeson. So obviously, if you look at the sources from this period, you got some guys who are wearing doublets, you got some guys who are just wearing their normal clothes, and then of course the armor goes over the top. But probably for those who wanted to be the most well-protected, they would actually wear a second layer of armor. That was what was known as an arming doublet or a gambeson. In this instance, right, it's usually made of threaded or quilted linen. It's very similar to actually what the Aztecs and the Incas would have been wearing in this period. This was pretty much the only kind of armor that they're going to be wearing, kind of like a sweater slash vest. And it's very effective. For the most part, you know, it's not going to turn aside most blades, but you know, it's going to give you a pretty good layer of protection. This usually kind of functions as your under armor of sorts. So basically the main armor will go over the top of this, and then obviously it's going to be stitched to it, which is going to give it some extra padding, extra flexibility and comfort. But in addition, this performs two functions. One, it gives you that extra layer of defense in case a blade or something does manage to go around or penetrate your armor. And number two, right, it's there primarily to protect you from the armor itself. Somebody who's done a lot of reenactments, you want something that's nice and cushy underneath that armor, otherwise you're going to pay for it later. Not only in muscle soreness, but it can physically cut you up. And so you can imagine in a battle where, you know, plates are going to get bashed and hit, etc., that it's probably best to have, you know, a nice concussive layer underneath that can absorb some of those concussive blows. So even if a round or if a blow doesn't necessarily go clear through the armor, right, you're still going to have to deal with the shock that comes from it. That can lead to, of course, internal injury, death, broken bones, etc. And so in a lot of ways, the gambeson is the reinforcement garment for the armor itself. It not only connects the armor to the other pieces, but it also is important because it gives you that insulation from it. The other pieces of equipment that we're going to be using primarily, at least the conquistadors would use, of course, is they're going to go into battle with their pants. Now, trousers in the medieval period are somewhat of a complicated topic because, you know, they had hose, they had trousers, they had all these different words for it, and they meant different things. Essentially, trousers, like we think of, are essentially you've got, you know, two legs connected into one garment that you can ultimately get into. These did happen in the medieval era. They weren't as common as hose, for example. Hose was all over the place. The differences between the two, trousers, obviously you've got both legs that are already stitched together. Hose, for the most part, are two separate pieces of cloth that are ultimately joined together, sometimes by a string, sometimes by a belt, sometimes by a codpiece. In this case, that's essentially what's going to be the case. In the 14 and 1500s, the nature of fashion had changed dramatically, and things started to become more frilly, they started to become more superfluous. A lot of this is because of the Swiss pikemen who at the time were dressing this way and all kinds of strange colors and stuff. And you can see this, for example, in the Pope's Guard. The Spanish were kind of more matter-of-fact about it, at least in the early stages, but they did adopt some aspects of it. One of the pieces, of course, that lasted as far as trousers were concerned, or as what was known as the codpiece. All right, so essentially the codpiece was basically something that would be used primarily to show off your, you know, the primary purpose was so that you could demonstrate that, you know, you as a man were definitely a man. But for the most part, you know, there was some fluff in there. Some have said that maybe it acts as a protective guard. Most of the fluff is linen or cotton based, so I don't think it's going to do a whole lot from something that goes straight at your private parts. But for the most part, it's still there. Certainly it's, you know, we think of, you know, I guess you can call it codpiece envy. There's even suits of armor. For example, Henry VIII has a suit of armor that he's famous for that has some protection for that region. You know, as a soldier going into battle, it's certainly not going to hurt you, but obviously it was probably more for fashion purposes than it was actual real protection. The other piece that the codpiece performs, which is really interesting, is that for the most part, you can see the leather strips. It basically can hold your pants together. If you're wearing hose in that situation, then you literally are wearing a pair of pants, which maybe you've heard this expression before. Pair refers to the fact that you actually had two pieces that were sewn together, usually primarily through strings or like we talked about before. Sometimes they would just latch onto your underwear. That was also used sometimes. So there's even depictions of medieval peasants running around in their underwear farming and doing that kind of stuff, and that's all they wear. So In this instance, things have become a little bit more, I guess you could call them civilized, but for the most part, many of the old medieval traditions still continue, like, for example, having two separate pairs of pants and then sewing them together into one. I use trousers simply because of the ease of use. Certainly soldiers that need to put them on quickly, needed to do what they needed to do, it's going to offer some advantages. The trousers usually are made of wool, linen. In this case, they're made of wool. It's going to give you a certain amount of insulation from the elements. Certainly in the heat of the New World, it's not going to be the most comfortable garment. They tend to be extremely tight, right, as you can see. That tend to be form-fitting, with something they won in the Renaissance era. It's not great for flexibility, but for the most part, those were some of the standards at the time as far as pants were concerned. In addition, you would wear your tunic. A tunic was essentially a garment that goes underneath of this even. I use it as my sweat rag, and this was basically what you would use to collect sweat. You would use it as one final layer of protection or comfort. Certainly on cold days, it's going to be fantastic. But in the heat of the New World, it's going to be problematic. Tunics were usually like a onesie for adults. They would extend very, very low, and that basically they were, really kind of pants and shirt in one. The Romans and Greeks had made use of them, certainly, and didn't usually have to wear accompanying pants alongside of them. It was basically your pants and your shirt in one. But the medieval period, they are separated. People are still wearing tunics, but they're also wearing pants as well. So those are some of the changes in fashion by this time. The last aspect of accoutrements that the conquistador is going to carry into battle are what you see here, right? Your shoes. Shoes were pretty simple. If you were a soldier and you get your hands on shoes, you were considered pretty lucky. A lot of conquistadors wore their shoes out within the first couple of months of marching all over the New World. And so a lot of times they would have to either purchase or steal the equipment of the native peoples. In particular, you're going to see, for example, sandals, native styles of clothing, native styles of shoes were adopted. That was not uncommon in the codexes and a lot of the sources from that time period. And primary sources attest to this as well, like Bernal Diaz, who talks about wearing Indian sandals. But for the most part, if you were a soldier that had shoes, you were pretty fortunate. The cavalrymen are largely going to wear boots. If you could afford to have boots, you would. But simple style medieval shoes haven't changed a whole lot, obviously, into the modern era. These obviously had toggles to fasten them, still made of leather. You see, of course, on the bottom of them, right, for the most part, they've got some tread on there for traction. But for the most part, they're pretty general, pretty basic shoes. The form and function of the shoe hasn't changed a whole lot over the centuries. It still performs the same generalized role. So in general, we've got the shoes, we've talked about the pants, we've talked about the nature of your under armor. What we're going to address next is to ultimately look at what it is the conquistador would wear into battle. So you might be wearing this on campaign, or we're going to take a look at what guys are going to do before they know they're going to go into the heat of battle. And so that's what we're going to take a look at next. One last feature as far as the accoutrements are concerned is to take a look at some of the leather aspects of what the conquistadors would wear. So as far as leather armor, the conquistadors aren't going to wear a lot of primary leather armor. It might be worn underneath, as for example, an arming doublet might be, but for the most part, they're going to have some other features. One of them is, of course, the baldric. So they're going to have a baldric of some sort that's going to suspend the sword. The sword is going to sit in what's known as a scabbard. Usually made of leather. It can have a wood core, but usually there's leather on the outside of it. Right, so obviously the baldric's function is simply to hold the sword at the side. Conquistadors usually had swords on the left-hand sides because of the length of the swords that they were drawing. So it was usually a little bit easier to do a cross draw, right? And so when you pull the sword out, even though it's quite long, right, to get it to where you want, right, it's easier to pull from the left-hand side, or from the right-hand side, it can be too long. So it's not like the Roman and Greek swords where for the most part you didn't have to worry about such things because they were much shorter. But with these, especially these longer early style rapiers, right, you're gonna have a pretty long sword. So for the most part you need a good size baldric and a good size belt to be able to accompany it. So obviously this is the nature of the sword, right, which is suspended from a baldric. You've also got your belt, right, a ring style belt, which was very common during the Renaissance era. Ring belts, for the most part, were made long on purpose so that the soldier could ultimately tie them and then take them through the loop. Very simple, you go under and then through the hole, and basically you've got a tied off ring belt. Ring belts were obviously easy to manufacture, cheap to maintain. You didn't have to put a buckle on them. In many cases, you don't even have to make holes on them. You could just ultimately string them together fairly quickly. And so yeah, ring belts were fairly common. You'll see a lot of them at Renaissance fairs. A lot of people in the 13, 14, and 1500s are going to wear belts that are in this style. In addition, right, you've got a holder, right, for your dagger, right, which basically holds it in place. Right, its job is ultimately to hold it so that you can draw it, right? You can basically pull it out. You can do your thing with it fairly quickly. And then if you need to, right, you can put it back in. So yeah, you've got leather holders for your dagger. You got leather holders for your sword. You got a baldric. You've got a ring belt, right? And basically these are some of the accoutrements that are going to help to keep your weapon safe. Obviously in the humidity and the heat of the New World, you're going to want something that's going to keep them secure so that when you do need them, right, they're going to be in the best shape possible. So these are just some of the leather aspects of what the conquistadors would use, and ultimately some of the things that they would use to secure their weapons and other aspects. Okay, we're taking a look at the armor of the conquistador. We'll take a look at the more heavily armed guys, and we'll talk about the nature of what the vast majority of guys would have been wearing during the conquest of the New World. First thing to discuss, of course, in any discussion of armor largely is breastplate. So this was also known as a cuirass. It had been known since antiquity. People have been wearing stuff that was similar to this, what we're going to call plate armor. One of the misconceptions that I hear a lot is the plate armor really starts to emerge in the 13 and 1400s. Well, the reality is that, yeah, it does, but it actually existed centuries past. Romans had developed a segmented armor that used plates. The Greeks had used bell cuirasses that had covered, obviously, much of the inner part of the body. So, you know, by all means, Europeans aren't the first to figure this out. There were other societies in the past that had used armor in a similar fashion, but this is going to be much more thick. It's made of solid steel. It's going to be very difficult for somebody to be able to penetrate this. Most of the contemporary weapons of the time are unable to penetrate plate armor. So wearing this meant that you were going to be very, very well protected, at least certainly better protected than most of the other soldiers on the battlefield. Again, I represent a rudolero, so these guys could have afforded breastplates depending on how successful they were. And if they could, they would certainly want to wear them because of the protection that they gave and the flexibility. Another myth that we get is this idea that, you know, when you're somebody who's wearing full plate armor, that you're not going to be able to move very effectively, right? I mean, I'm not obviously going to be able to dance very well just because I can't dance, period. But the bottom line is that you've got, you know, this thing here that provides good protection. It's really only about 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter thick, depending on the examples that we found. I mean, you could get thicker, but at that point, it just starts getting so heavy that it's really cumbersome. This thing really isn't that bad. I mean, you can move in it. You can ultimately dodge if you need to. You can run for short distances. I wouldn't recommend running a marathon in it, but it's still very effective. You know, it's not this myth that once you get knocked off your horse or knocked into the ground that you're not going to be able to get up. That's just not true. The armor was form-fitting. Usually it would connect to a garment underneath called an akiton or an arming jacket, and it could actually connect via straps or leather strips so that it's well suited to fit the body. So this is one of the myths that I wanted to bust about the nature of the breastplate, is that, you know, people who wore this, it's so heavy they can't move around. I mean, you're looking at probably an additional 10 to 20 pounds that it's going to add. But, you know, if you're an infantryman in Iraq, for example, you know, you're probably going to wear way more protective gear, and certainly because of your ammunition, you're probably going to have more weight that you're carrying around than what a conquistador did. So the nature of these guys carrying just, these Herculean amounts of weight is simply not necessarily correct. So the breastplate itself gives really good protection. It's obviously something that soldiers who could afford, they're going to try to wear. The one drawback to this, of course, is that it's made of iron. In the New World, you know, you're going to run into problems with rust, etc. But they have some interesting ways to combat that. The easiest way, which is the one we do today, is to paint it. I tend to believe that armor was in some cases painted, right? If you were somebody who didn't want to put a fresh coat of oil on it every time you take it out. The other thing, of course, is that they had servants. So these guys didn't wear these things 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They had servants, they had Indians, in some cases slaves, who would carry their kit for them. And then right before they would go into battle, that's when they would slip this stuff on. So they're not going to be wearing it all day long, right, for hours at a time. Usually, you know, unless circumstances are absolutely dire, you know, they're going to slip this thing on, go into battle, you know, and then when they're done, they're going to go back to the regular clothes. And the codexes and primary sources indicate this as well. So that's what's known as your breastplate. Now, attached to the breastplate, you've got these things here called tassets, right? The tassets, you can see, are basically little pieces of metal that hang off of the original plate, and their job is to give you some additional protection here in the hips. Obviously, you've got the femoral artery in here. You've got some other, things that are particularly vulnerable, and so the tassets can address that. And so they also help, particularly if you were to wear the thigh pieces and the leg pieces, they kind of give you some overlap so that there's not going to be a tremendous amount of gap in between where your armor is and where your body's going to be. And so the tassets help to kind of relieve that. And so soldiers that could get armor that had tassets attached would certainly do so. Right, so that's the nature of some of the garments to protect your abdomen. Now, other things that would be worn for personal protection, right? You can see right here, right? This is what's known as your gorget, all right? It's a neck piece. Later in the 18th century, these became ceremonial. You'll see British soldiers, for example, French soldiers that are wearing a gorget, not necessarily to protect them from musket fire, but because it's, it's a sign of status or a status of rank. Well, in this era, it does provide some protection. The good thing is it's kind of a doublet that goes over the top of the armor. It gives you additional protection, particularly to the neck, all right, which is, the big weakness with any kind of plate armor is that although the armor itself is very good, there's going to be gaps, right, whether the shoulder and the neck, and the hips, because you have to be able to turn, you have to be able to move and anticipate. So the gorget is really good at being able to provide you with some protection so you don't end up neckless, all right, so that basically when you go into battle, you're going to keep, the head that you had when you started. So basically the gorget is there to give you some additional protection. A lot of battle stances, a lot of fighting in this era involves maneuvers that come from over the top, just because you've got the flow of gravity with you, which is going to give you that additional force. And so you want that extra reinforcement in the neck area, and that's largely what your gorget is going to do. Can you still turn your neck? Yeah, it's not impossible. It's certainly not great, as far as your flexibility, right? But obviously, you're going to pay for that to make sure that you're going to be protected. And so that's largely what your gorget is going to do. The last element of personal protection that we'll take a look at, right, is this right here for your noggin, right? Your helmet, right? This is what was referred to as a morion, and this is probably the most distinctive part of the conquistador's armor. When people see this, they automatically think, oh, that's a conquistador, right? Because they've seen this hat around, right? Especially with this, this broad brim on it, right? It's a very beautiful helmet. It's essentially an evolution of other kinds of helms that had come before it. Like, for example, the pot style helm. This one had the raised edges on it, which obviously are going to deflect blows. It also, of course, can have decorations, so you can kind of see, right, the nature in here. There's little, carvings into it. So if you're somebody of status, right, you can get a helmet that's going to have a little bit of extra stuff on it. Sometimes they would have plumes sticking out of them. But for the most part, the helmet performs the same vital function. That's, of course, to protect your noggin, right, to protect your head. This helmet tends to be very, very effective, so much so that it was used for over 150 years. People in Jamestown, right, were equipped with these kinds of helms. They were called morions, okay? The morion helmet actually was not in wide use by the conquistadors, even though much of contemporary imagination imagines it with them. The reality is that much of what was written about the conquistadors was written later. So it was assumed at the time that that was the most popular helmet. At that time was the morion in the 1600s. So it was assumed that conquistadors used it back then. It really begins to emerge on European battlefields really in the 1520s-ish. And then probably, you might have had some of the later conquistador expeditions that would have used it. And so it's not as commonly used as one would think. It was used by conquistadors, but you're not going to see it in the conquest of Mexico. You're probably not going to see it in the conquest of Peru. It's going to really date after those. And so it's kind of interesting that we think that, this is the helm that conquistadors wear when the vast majority of them did not. There were other kinds of helmets. Everything from the pot helm, the kettle helm, which was widely used, and they used other types as well. So the morion is more of a later invention, but it's something, of course, that even to this day inspires the imagination of the conquistador. Because of all of its raised edges, right, there's not a lot of places where you're going to get a direct impact. So any weapon is going to glance either off of the bill or it's going to come off of one of the raised sides, or you've got this extra reinforcement right here in the middle. All of those things, it's got padding on the inside that's going to give you some protection. So it really provided really good protection at a very low cost. And so it became known as the pikeman's pot, because especially by the 1600s, everybody was wearing these. In the 30 Years' War, for example, you're going to see morions fairly common. I mean, it's just because of the nature of how cheap they were, and they became kind of a style part as well. People like the style of the helmet as well. So that's the nature of the morion helmet and why it's effective as well. All right, so that pretty much covers most of the personal armor. What we're going to be taking a look at next is the weaponry. So why is it that these Spanish conquistadors were able to defeat much larger groups of Indians? Let's take a look at their weapons and find out. One last piece of personal protective armor that you can see here is what's known as your greaves. So obviously soldiers should go into battle, right? They could have some leg protection as well. So in this instance, these are what are known as greaves. Greaves essentially are going to protect your knee, they're going to protect your shins. These are pretty vulnerable places that you can be struck. And so basically, of course, you've got some nice metal reinforcement here. You still got, of course, pretty decent walking abilities, right? The greaves ultimately fasten in the back. Some are more gravity fitting. They're literally folded to the user and they fit around the calf. Obviously, I'm not, somebody who can afford something that's so expensive. But for the most part, yeah, they can use straps as well in the back. We've seen examples of historical museums of how they strap. But basically, these are what are known as greaves. They've been in use since ancient times to protect the shins, which are particularly vulnerable. And they still give you a certain amount of free range of movement. You could kick somebody with them too. It's probably going to hurt. But in general, these guys are going to be using a shield, right? The shield, of course, is going to protect a pretty good amount of the body. And so, of course, the one part that's going to be vulnerable, of course, is that part down there with the legs. So even, somebody who's going like this, deflecting, you still got that vulnerable spot down there. So largely, you've got these greaves in place that can help you tremendously when it comes to defending your legs. All right, so as promised, we already looked at the personal protection, so now we're going to take a look at the weapons of the Conquistador. Everything from rapiers to crossbows to polearms. So we'll look at basically a sprinkling of the various weapons that Conquistadors would have used in the New World, and we'll give some brief comparisons as to what the native peoples were using at this time. So obviously looking at the question, why were small numbers of Spaniards able to prevail over much larger groups of natives? But one of the answers to that question lies in the weaponry that they're going to use. So as we talked about, the kind of soldier that I represent is what is known as a rodolero, right? Rodoleros were so named because they would use this style shield called the rodella, right? Obviously, it's a good size shield. It's going to protect much of the body, right? And so obviously going into battle, you can use it to deflect blows, right? It's obviously got the rounded edges so that it's not going to be able to take weapons in a direct impact, which is good. And obviously because of its steel nature, it's going to be really good at being able to ultimately deflect most of the missile weapons that native peoples are going to throw at them, right? So anything from, for example, spears, atlatls, arrows, most of these things are going to be deflected by the shield itself because of the steel rim and the steel nature. It usually would have wood or leather on the inside to brace it. And so for the most part, this is going to be the primary form of personal protection that soldiers known as rodoleros will carry. In Europe, these guys were primarily used in what was called the tercio formation. Tercios were basically so named in Spanish because of threes. They would have essentially pikemen who would fight in the front rank. You would have musketeers who could ultimately switch if necessary or fire right at the enemy pikemen. They could also keep horsemen at bay. And then you had the last group of people who were your sword and buckler guys or your rodello guys. They would run in there with their swords and they would basically cut down pikes. And we'll talk about that when we get to the sword. So the shield was obviously an important part of what made this particular type of troop. And in fact, they were named after it because of their effectiveness. They worked really well against the Moors during the Crusades. And obviously these tactics are going to be brought to the New World to face off against the natives that are here as well. So that's the shield, right? Also known as the rodella, right? Used by conquistadors in the New World. Now, other weapons that we'll take a look at. One of the most important and iconic that most people like to discuss and look at is this, right? The sword, okay? Now, conquistador swords came in a variety of forms and functions. They're anything from broadswords that would have been very common on medieval battlefields to more slender rapier designs, all right? The conquistadors at this time were using real primitive rapiers, like the one that you see here. They're still going to be somewhat thick. They're going to be long, but they will be narrower than your typical broadsword because at the time, the steelmaking technology was getting better. One of the advantages of fighting the Moors was that the Spanish had figured out that their technology in ironworking was better than what they were using. So they could make steel that was much thinner and lighter, but yet was still going to pack quite a punch. And so this is where we start to see the first primitive rapiers that later are going to be very common during the Shakespearean era, for example, or later on in the 1600s when they become much more slender. But these are still somewhat thick because their original design was to cut pikes. So as we discussed before, these guys would run in during a push of pike on a European battlefield, and their job was largely to get in there with their shield and their sword, right? And they could deflect, right, pikes away, and then basically they can cut and slice those pikes down, all right? The advantage of that is if the enemy has 8-foot pikes and you have 16-foot pikes, then you now have an advantage. So when you go to push, right, you're going to have that extra 8 feet that's going to help you out. So in Europe, that's what they originally were used for, right? And as shock troops, right, to cut holes in the enemy line. In the New World, obviously the new peoples here are not going to have a whole lot of pikes. And if they do, they're going to be, you know, personal use spears, not really the phalanx style tactics that you're going to see, for example, in much of European battlefields pioneered by the Swiss. So what the Spanish are largely going to be using these for is just to kill as many native peoples as possible. The thinness of the rapier allows it to be manipulated quickly, right? You can cut with it, right? Obviously, it's very good to thrust, right? Basically, soldiers could ultimately defend and cut at the same time, and it gave them a lot of versatility, right? That's going to allow them to be very successful. And so the nature of the shield and the sword are ultimately going to allow for you to be able to cut the enemy, and they're not going to have a whole lot of attacking windows and angles to get back at you with. So these things were very devastating against native peoples. They did not have steel or steel technology. Certainly they didn't have the means to stop it. So much of the arming jackets and things that you'll see people in the New World use, these things are going to cut right through them. So basically they're using very, very effective technologies as far as being able to be successful. So that's the nature of the Spanish sword, which is called the espada ropera, right, or the side sword. And that rodoleros would use these alongside with their shields to create advantages and ultimately to open up formations. And so this is one of the more savage aspects, right, of the Conquistador's kit, right? Everything from slashing wounds to stabbing. This thing's going to be very balanced and it's going to work for a variety of tasks. One last thing I wanted to point out about the Spanish sword, right, is you can see the nature of the handguard, right? So it's called a swept hilt rapier, right? It's got this hilt that protects the hand, right? It's got this little piece right there, right? That's going to ultimately give you some protection. It also looks cool. You've even got these little pieces here in the middle that are designed to trap swords. So when you go to block, for example, you could ultimately block somebody's sword. You can ultimately bring them down into a position where you can control them. And if your side weapon is a dagger, for example, you can go in and stab them or punch them with the shield or, you know, whatever you want. You can then manipulate the enemy into doing what you want them to do. So the nature of the sword, the nature of its guard, very elaborate, very cool looking, very well-balanced weapon. These were some of the primary weapons that soldiers would use in the New World. The next weapon we'll take a look at is the halberd. So we'll look at some pole weapons and some of the advantages of them as well. All right, so we're continuing our lessons here on the weapons of the Conquistador. The next weapon that we're going to take a look at is a polearm that is known as the halberd. All right, this is a weapon that obviously has a tremendous amount of significance. It's very versatile, and it can be used in a variety of ways. The halberd itself is characterized really as 3 weapons in one. So you can take a look. You've got obviously your axe head, which can be used like an axe. You've got your spearhead, which can be used obviously to poke, to keep enemies at a distance. Right, and then lastly, of course, you've got the hook side, which can be used to grab mounted men and throw them into the dirt. So effectively, you can take it, right, if somebody's coming at you, right, you can grab them, you can pull them down, and then at that point, you can finish them off, right, with the halberd itself. So the advantage, of course, of this 3 weapons in one is also, of course, its size, right? Halberds tend to be 6-7 feet long. They could be longer depending on who's wielding it and what it's doing. But the advantage of this weapon is that you can keep the enemy at a distance, right? You can poke, you can prod, you can find openings in armor, which is what that little hook part is really good at doing. And it's really good at getting around plate armor, which was obviously the dominant armor of the day. So this was used very well on European battlefields. It's not going to be as awesome on Native American battlefields, simply because there's not a lot of armor. The armor they do wear is usually cotton. It's stuff that can be penetrated fairly easily. So this one isn't going to be as effective as you're going to see in Europe, but it's still going to be very effective at killing enemies, right? It's a cheap, no-nonsense solution, right, to being anti-cavalry defense. And even though the peoples of the New Worlds didn't have cavalry, all right, they still had soldiers that could be kept at a distance. And so what Cortez talks about and Bernal Diaz talks about is that halberds were largely used to keep the enemy at a distance so that musketeers could reload, so that crossbowmen could reload, so that they could fire, and so that their missile troops could ultimately inflict as many casualties as possible, particularly the gunners who could inspire fear from their weapons. And so the combination of halberd and muskets and crossbows was ultimately going to be very deadly for the peoples here of the New World. And so, yeah, you have the halberd, right, which combines your 3 weapons in one, right? Obviously, the versatility of an axe, right, the poking abilities of a spear, and then lastly, of course, the ability to ultimately hook enemies and then finish them off on the ground. And so halberds could be used in a variety of ways to be a very effective tool that would have been used by the conquistadors here in the New World. The last of the major weapons we'll take a look at is the knife. And so we'll look at, you know, let's say that you're a halberder and you break your halberd, and let's say that you lose your sword. What do you do then? Well, then you get your last ditch weapon, and we'll take a look at the functionality, right, of the Renaissance era knife next. All right, so let's say that all your weapons are broken, you're down to your last ditch effort. What do? Well, in this instance, conquistadors would carry on them a knife, right? So obviously the last of the weapons the conquistador are going to have, right, is a knife that looks somewhat like this. By the Renaissance era, knives were beginning to change again. Not that really knives have changed a whole lot through history. The form and shape have been somewhat similar for many years, but they really begin to change fundamentally during this era because of the nature of plate armor. Certainly these things aren't going to penetrate the plate, so they got to find ways around it. And so this is where you get stuff like this, right? These kinds of daggers that are called rondels, right? Because of their round shape, right? Basically, the nature of this is a very thin point, and it's very light. So the point is to be able to find those gaps in the armor, right? The neck, right? The armpits, right? The hips, right? Wherever you can find it, you know, go up under the armor, find gaps in it, find holes in it somewhere, and manipulate in there, right? And stab in there. Obviously, this is a very effective weapon. Once people had been knocked down, for example, if they were wounded, this was a kind of finishing off weapon that was really good at being able to, you know, finish somebody who was already down. Certainly against people in the New World who didn't have super advanced armor, this thing would have killed just as readily as any of the other weapons that we talked about. The only decrease, of course, being that it, you know, has a smaller reach. But yeah, these rondel-style daggers, you can see it's got the hexagonal-style hilt on it, right? And then, of course, on the pommel side, same thing. It's got this kind of twistiness. So it's basically designed so that you really just twist that thing in there right when you stab somebody. And so as far as the nature of the knife, this was a very effective weapon that if all else failed, right, you could go down to. In fact, there's even knowledge too that people in the Renaissance would fight with this and the sword. So this was a good offhand weapon as well. So you might decide, right, that you're going to pull your sword out, right, and you're going to fight, and then essentially you would have this as your offhand weapon. So you could use the sword, right, to parry blows, and then you can obviously stab in here with the knife. So there's a lot of manuals, including Talhofer and others, that describe these different methods of being able to counter people that are fighting in this way. And it was very common. And so the reality was that soldiers had been familiar with the dagger. It could be used in a variety of ways. It could be manipulated to their advantage. And then, of course, you know, they could use it to defeat downed opponents as well. So that's the nature of some of the advantages of using the rondel-style Spanish dagger. Okay, we'll go over the procedure on how to load and fire a crossbow. So essentially, as we discussed before, crossbows were very important weapons to the Spanish during their conquest of the New World. So we'll go over a little bit about the nature of how to load and fire these. First of all, the one that we'll be using here, right, obviously is a replica, right? I would never be able to get my hands on one that's an original, right? I'm a poor teacher's salary anyway. But basically, this is a replica of the kinds of bows that are going to be used. So to load and fire them is a fairly simple procedure. It's pretty straightforward. This is why you see peasant armies being equipped with these, because you can train and equip guys with these pretty quickly. So for the most part, to load and fire the crossbow, you gotta be familiar with a few terms. Obviously, we've got the wood stock, right, which is what the bow sits on, right? You've got the tiller mechanism, you've got a firing mechanism in here, which essentially switches over when you pull the trigger, which is here, right? You've got a kind of primitive sight, right? That's basically here, right? And then in general, you've got a nice, you know, twine rope. They usually made them out of hemp. They can make them out of women's hair. Throughout history, they've been made with all kinds of different stuff, but you've got essentially your bow string, which is going to be drawn back. You've got the stirrup, which essentially is what, just like, you know, if you're a cowboy or if you're somebody who rides horses, you're going to use this to put your foot in. And then essentially you're going to draw this back so that it ultimately locks into place. Once it does, you will load your device, right? The bow arms are largely going to provide the tension that is needed to fire. This again is a very small scale crossbow, so this isn't like the originals that were 2,500 pounds. This one doesn't require the use of a windlass or any of that kind of stuff. It's only about 100 pounds, so you know, it's a pretty good workout still. But in general, this one can be drawn back by hand. And so basically, essentially, the archer either pulls the string back into position for each fire, or has a device like a windlass or something else that would ultimately latch onto the string, and then you would have to crank it into position. And then eventually, once it gets ready, you would follow the same procedure. So those are some of the general guidelines as far as shooting a crossbow. What we're going to do at this point is actually go through a test firing. One last thing to keep in mind about crossbows, right? What they fire. All right, they're going to fire ammunition that's going to be much smaller than an arrow. It's what's called a quarrel, right? Or it's sometimes referred to as a bolt. All right, so they're going to fire more like a dart than what you're going to see in a traditional arrow. Sometimes it is fletched, sometimes it is not. In general, the fletching, you know, can make a difference as far as making it travel further. Some decided to fire ones without it, but basically the impact is the same. I mean, these things are going to have tremendous armor piercing capabilities at close range. They're going to be very, very powerful. And so that's why I think armies tended to prefer to arm with the crossbow as it preferred to other tried and true methods, like, for example, the longbow, which required a lot of skill to use. The crossbow, you know, is a little bit more forgiving in that regard. It fires on a much straighter trajectory. It's much flatter. And so tactics ultimately reflect this. And also, of course, you're not going to get as many shots off. As you'll see by pulling the bowstring back, and especially if you're using a windlass or a crank, you're looking at maybe 2 to 3 shots a minute. Whereas, you know, a longbowman, somebody in 100 Years' War is going to be pumping out, you know, as many as 10, maybe even 12. So you're not going to get as much firepower, but the weapons that you do put on target are going to make an awful impact. So without further ado, let's do a test fire. Okay, so we went over crossbow terminology. We talked about the nature of what a crossbow does. All right, now let's actually do a test fire. So without further ado, let's go through the presentation. So first of all, of course, you want to put your foot in the stirrup, right? You want to get it nice and comfortable. So let me back up a little bit so y'all can see. All right, so I've got my foot in the stirrup like this. All right, I want to pull the string back into position so that it locks. All right, once it's locked, and essentially at this point, I've got an armed bow ready to go. At this point is when you're going to put your ammunition in. So I've got my bolt that I'll basically put in here, make sure that it's snug into the bolt string, and at this point it's ready to fire. And so again, it doesn't seem like a whole lot of stuff to do, but when you're under fire, of course, obviously the more repetition you have, the better. And this is in general how they're going to load. Again, if you've got a crank or you've got some kind of a windlass design, then you're going to have to obviously pull it into place with that device. This one, of course, is a smaller crossbow, so it's not as big a deal. So as you can see, it obviously makes a pretty big dent. I mean, this isn't even a super powerful crossbow, but obviously it's going to penetrate pretty deeply. This one, of course, if I was hunting deer, I would have missed just slightly off the lungs, as you can see here. But in general, if you hit a human being with this, it's still going to hurt. So the kind of shot you can see as far as deep as it goes in, right? Obviously, you got that big point, right? And it's going to put a pretty good sized hole in the target. Certainly, you're going to be bleeding from that. I don't know if it'll necessarily kill you, but you know, it's going to hurt. Again, and this is a low power crossbow as well. All right, so this completes our study of the Spanish Conquistador as far as talking about the armor, the weapons, the accoutrements, and the historical context of what was going on, right? I hope all of you enjoyed it, especially those of you in my 1301, 1302 classes, even my World Civ classes as well. Again, I get the question frequently, why do you do this? Well, number one, I do it because it's fun, I enjoy it. And number two, because again, I think that it's a lot easier if you can see it, that you can understand it, all right? That's the whole motto that we have here, right? At Hands-On History, right? That we don't just learn history, we live it. So I think that by doing the reenactments, by showing you the different weapons and armor, I think that it makes it more real for you. And hopefully, encourages you to do some research, hopefully maybe even go so far as to start a Spanish reenacting group or a conquistador or a medieval Renaissance group, right? Maybe join a HEMA group, right? There's lots of avenues to explore if you're interested in this era. And so I know, especially, here in the States that, especially when it comes to European reenacting, it's going to be few and far between in a lot of places, but, obviously we have a lot of fun. There's a lot of cool things that can come out of this era, and it really helps to explain us as a people. So that does it for Hands-On History today as far as our study of the Spanish Conquistador. Keep the conversation going. Feel free to leave comments, likes, etc. If you've got your own story you'd like to share, feel free to do so. And for those of you that are part of my classes, right, thank you for tuning in, right? You will have assignment to be named later. And for those of you, of course, that are just tuning in for general information, thanks for stopping by. If you have other eras you want me to take a look at, make sure that you post them in the comments. I'll take a look at them, and hopefully if I have a limited budget. Again, I'm a poor public school teacher, but if it's something that's feasible and something that I can do, then I'll for sure try to do it. In addition, I'll try to post some sources in the comments as well. So if you're interested in primary sources and looking up stuff, or in general, just trying to make me look like I'm totally full of shit, feel free to do so. I'll post those in there as well. So again, thanks for tuning in. This has been a production of Hands-On History, where we do not just learn history, we live it. See you guys. Yo, it's hot as balls in this thing, and I need a drink.